Last week we spent a lot of time on tendons, and part of that was because tendons are a good way to learn about some of these mechanical properties like viscoelasticity that also apply to cartilage and to ligaments. So in this video I want to go over a little bit of additional material about cartilage and ligaments. Some of this we covered at least in brief last week, but some of it we did not. So a reminder, cartilage, it's that little layer of tissue in the joint space, that has this interesting property called viscoelasticity, and what that manifests as is on the stress-strain curve, a viscoelastic material, if you load it slowly, might look like this. But if you load it quickly, like if you're landing from a jump, it would look like this. So the shape and the steepness of this slope depends on the rate of loading. And cartilage has this property, as does ligaments and tendons. So in cartilage, the reason for this viscoelasticity has to do with the movement of water around in the collagen matrix. So perhaps you remember from last week, if you took a slice of cartilage and looked at it under a microscope, its collagen fibers would be kind of in this complex three-dimensional matrix-like arrangement. And kind of like a sponge, water can flow around inside that matrix. And just like you might have a viscous, like water-filled something, the viscoelasticity of cartilage fundamentally comes from the water content of that matrix. Like tendons and ligaments, cartilage also has this toe region here on the stress-strain curve, meaning it doesn't just become, it doesn't just go up in linear fashion. First, there's this toe region, then you have a linear region like this. And that also has to do with how the collagen fibers are arranged. There's also a property of cartilage called, or it displays a mechanical property called creep. And what that looks like is this. Imagine you have some constant stress, meaning force divided by area, that you're going to apply to some cartilage. You apply that stress, and then the cartilage will deform, of course. It'll squish down. And then if you keep the force constant, it will gradually deform a little bit more. And I think we mentioned this last week, but that has to do with water getting essentially squished out of the material. So that might have something to do with why cartilage responds differently to different durations of loading. So for example, standing on your feet for a long time seems to do more damage to cartilage than walking or running, even if sort of the sum of all the forces added up over time is about the same. And that has to do with this phenomena of creep. That's like if you have a, say you had like a blob of silly putty and you put something heavy on it. There'd be some initial deformation, of course. But then over time, it would gradually squish more and more and more into the putty. Clay has this property too. So that's a mechanical property called creep. And it's most pronounced in cartilage, but also you see it to some degree in ligaments and tendons as well. Now, ligaments, which as a reminder, connect bones to other bones. Remember, a tendon connects a bone to a muscle. Ligaments are very, very structurally similar to tendons, except that they connect bone to bone. They also have many of these same mechanical properties. So their stress-strain curve, a ligament, you have a toe region, then you have a linear region, and then eventually, if the stress gets too much, you get this plastic region, and then either failure up here or some deformation, and then failure down here. This being the plastic region over here. The mechanical interpretation of once you cross this threshold is that the collagen fibers that are so nicely arranged in the ligament, they're just getting stretched out in here, but once you get into the plastic region, they start breaking. So from an injury perspective, anytime you get up into this area, that's like a ligament strain. And you might be deforming, lengthening, damaging those collagen fibers. And of course, if this happens, this is like an ACL tear. That's just, you go up the whole way and it breaks. So we talked last week a good bit about how exercise affects the mechanical properties of tendons. And we saw that, for example, young people have stress-strain curves for their tendons that look like this. Older people have stress-strain curves that look like this. The same is true for people who exercise a lot versus people who are totally sedentary, or people who have been immobilized, like in a wheelchair for a long time, for example. And this phenomena is less true for ligaments and cartilage, although it's also harder to study this because there are fewer ligaments that are really close to the surface of the skin, like the Achilles tendon is. So it's very easy to study things like the Achilles tendon and the patellar tendon. Some people say patellar tendon is a ligament, as we mentioned last week. But harder, as you might imagine, to study, say, the ACL or the MCL. But exercise does seem to alter the mechanical properties of ligaments a bit. And likewise, aging also seems to alter the mechanical properties of ligaments. So this graph here is at least conceptually similar for tendons and ligaments with regards to age. So let me annotate this. This would be like young people, and this would be old here. So lower ultimate strength, lower stiffness. With tendons, we also talked about how we could interpret the area under the curve of the stress strain curve as stored energy. So, for example, when you run or when you jump, you store up energy in your Achilles tendon, and then when you go back down, meaning when you push off the ground, you can release that energy. And as a reminder, you don't get to release all of it because there's that thing called hysteresis. So you go up, you store this much energy, you come back down, and it looks like that, and you release that much energy. So the difference between those two, meaning that much, that's the energy lost due to hysteresis. But anyways, ligaments, we talked about how tendons can store energy. And it's less common for us to think about ligaments doing this, but they are perfectly capable of doing it. A good example, maybe my favorite example, is the midfoot joints right here. So you've got all these cuneiform muscles kind of connecting to where the metatarsals go up. And if you look at an anatomic diagram, you will see that there's a bunch of little ligaments in here across the midfoot. And there are very few strong muscles that cross that area. You have a few of the flexor muscles of the toes that go, like the FHL and the FHL and the FDL, sorry, that kind of go down here and then they come up the back. But there isn't a whole lot of muscular strength. Those are not super strong muscles. So your body uses these ligaments to stretch and store energy in the arch of your foot when you're walking. So or running for that matter, or jumping. So when your foot is in this position, your arch will flatten out a little bit and store up energy. Now, you may be familiar with a biological structure called the plantar fascia, which many people think of as almost like a ligament, which goes right here. And that does a good deal of storing energy, and it does so, by the way, just like this, so storing energy under a stress strain curve. But if you do a cadaver dissection and you cut up the plantar fascia, you'll find that the arch still retains a good amount of rigidity, and that comes from energy stored in the midfoot ligaments, because of course a cadaver can't contract its muscles, so clearly that rigidity can't be coming from muscles either. So it's less common, but we can think about ligaments, especially in the midfoot and probably some other places in the body that just aren't coming to mind to me right now. We can think of ligaments as being able to store energy as well.